3 times. They cut his fence 3 times before sunrise, without warning, without leaving a name. And 3 times he got up the next morning and strung it again. The open range, 80 million acres of unfenced Kansas grass that had been the property of everyone and therefore the property of no one. Cattle moved across it freely. The Chisholm Trail ran straight through it. Hundreds of thousands of longhorns every year walking north to the Kansas railheads as if the land itself belonged to the drive. And one Kansas homesteader in 1875 had just bought a roll of wire that was going to change all of it. Not just his farm. All of it. His name was Jonas Holt. He was 31 years old. He had filed his homestead claim in Ellis County, Kansas in 1872. 160 acres of flat Kansas grassland, grazed by Texas longhorns every summer since before he arrived. In the spring of 1875, a salesman from the Washburn and Moen Company came through Ellis County selling a product patented the year before by a DeKalb, Illinois farmer named Joseph Glidden. 2 twisted steel strands, sharp barbs at regular intervals, sold by the pound. Jonas Holt bought a roll. By the end of that week, 12 posts set and 3 strands strung along the south boundary. The wire cost him $8.40. The labor cost him 2 days of his own time. He drove the last staple on a Thursday evening and stood back and looked at the fence in the last light. It was not beautiful. It was not impressive. But it was the first legally defined boundary his 160 acres had ever had. And somewhere in Ellis County, someone saw it going up and did not like it. To understand why 3 men cut Jonas Holt's fence in the middle of the night, you need to understand what the Kansas open range actually was. Not as an idea, as a living economic system that had been feeding people and building fortunes since the end of the Civil War. Between 1867 and 1875, over 1.5 million longhorn cattle walked the Chisholm Trail from Texas to the Kansas railheads. That grass was free. That water was free. That crossing was free. It had always been free. And then Jonas Holt put up a fence. Before barbed wire, the Kansas homesteader had 3 choices for protecting his crops from drifting cattle. Sawed walls. They collapsed in heavy rain. A longhorn leaned against them and walked through. Hedgerows, Osage orange, thorns thick enough to turn cattle if the plants were mature. Mature meant 7 to 10 years of waiting while your crops were eaten every summer. The third? Nothing. Under Kansas law, a farmer whose land was not fenced with a lawful fence could not collect damages when cattle destroyed his crops. The law favored the cattle, not the farmer. Then came the devil's rope. Joseph Glidden's patent, 2 twisted strands of steel wire with short, sharp barbs at regular intervals. Cheap to manufacture, easy to install, weather-resistant, completely indifferent to the size of the animal that pushed against it. In 1874, 5 tons manufactured in the United States. In 1880, 40,000 tons. In 1890, 200,000 tons. But in 1875 in Ellis County, Kansas, the man who understood what those numbers were going to become was the man who bought the first roll. The first cut came on a Tuesday morning. Jonas Holt woke at dawn and went to check his south boundary and found his fence on the ground. Not torn, not tangled, cut, clean at each post, every strand. Someone had come in the night with a pair of pliers and removed the fence as methodically as Jonas had installed it. No note, no name, no footprints that told him anything he didn't already know. There were men in Ellis County who moved cattle across his south boundary every spring. and those men had not been asked whether they wanted a fence there. The drovers who moved cattle through Ellis County were not, in the main, lawless men. They were men doing a job that the United States economy had depended on for a decade. At the feed merchant in Hayes, a drover named Vic Hollander said it plainly one afternoon to nobody in particular and everybody at once. A man who fences grass that cattle have grazed since before he got here is not protecting property. He is stealing range. The men around him were quiet in a way that meant they agreed. Jonas Holt replaced his fence the next morning. He did not go to the county sheriff. He did not go to the feed merchant and put his grievance in front of the room. He bought more wire at 12 cents a pound, and he strung it again. The second cut came 3 weeks later. Same method, same precision, same silence. He strung it a third time. The third cut came with a different message. The fence was down, and his corn, 40 acres of it on the north side, had been walked through. Not by an accident of cattle drifting, by a deliberate crossing. He stood in his ruined cornfield in the early morning and understood two things simultaneously. The first, whoever was doing this had decided cutting the fence alone was not enough. The second, the message was not going to change what Jonas Holt was going to do next. But he stood there longer than he normally stood anywhere. Not angry, just tired. The particular tiredness that comes from asking yourself whether persistence has become stupidity. He stood in the ruined corn for a long time. Then he reached into his coat pocket, found the staples, and went to buy more wire. Jonas Holt did not go to the sheriff after his corn was destroyed. He went to the Ellis County land office. He filed a formal description of his property boundary as a recorded legal document. He paid 40 cents for the filing. Then he went home. He bought more wire. Longer this time, enough for the south boundary and half the east. His neighbor to the west, a German immigrant named Heinrich Baumer, who had been watching Jonas's fence wars with a careful eye, came over one evening. "You're going to keep doing this?" Baumer asked. Jonas looked at his new posts already set in the ground. "I'm going to fence the whole claim," he said. Baumer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How much is the wire?" Here is what Jonas Holt understood that Vic Hollander did not. Not because Jonas was smarter, not because he had access to different information, because Jonas Holt was a farmer who had been watching cattle destroy his crops every summer since he arrived. And Vic Hollander was a drover who had never had to watch anything be destroyed, because he owned nothing that could be destroyed. That is a different relationship with the land. And it leads to a different calculation. The calculation was simple. In 1874, 5 tons of barbed wire produced. In 1875, 300 tons. In 1880, 40,000 tons. That number, 300 to 40,000 in 5 years, does not describe a product finding a market. It describes a world changing its mind. The men who understood that change earliest were the men who built their fence before anyone else had built theirs, and built it again when it was cut, because every fence that went up, even when it came down, was evidence. Evidence that land had an owner. His wife, Clara, asked him one evening after the second cut had been rebuilt, "Is this worth it?" Not with bitterness. Not as an ultimatum, the way a woman asks when she's been watching a man spend himself on something that keeps getting destroyed. Jonas looked at his fence line in the last light, then at the 40 acres of corn still standing on the north side of it. "Last summer," he said, "they walked through half of it. This summer they didn't touch it." Clara said nothing. Then she went inside to start supper. He checked the wire at the south post, the one that always needed tightening, then reached into his coat pocket. He always carried staples there. Had since the first morning he found the fence down. Jonas Holt had understood something about the Homestead Act of 1862 that the fence cutters had not thought through. Under the Act, a homesteader had to demonstrate improvement of his land to complete his claim. And fencing the boundary with a documented, recorded, filed boundary description was the strongest form of improvement a Kansas homesteader could make. Every time Jonas Holt rebuilt his fence, every post, every strand, every staple was a legal act of property improvement. Every time they cut his fence, he rebuilt it. And every time he rebuilt it, he was making a legal record of exactly where his land was. The cutting was making his case for him, and they didn't know it. By the spring of 1876, Jonas Holt's fence had been standing without interruption for 8 months. The cuttings had stopped, not because anyone had changed their mind, but because 12 other homesteaders in Ellis County had strung barbed wire that same year. Then 18, then 30. Vic Hollander could cut one man's fence in the night. He could not cut 30 men's fences and still move cattle to the Kansas Pacific. The argument was not won by law. It was won by wire. The year was 1883, 8 years after Jonas Holt strung his first fence. What had been a quiet local argument in Ellis County had become a war across the western plains. Historians call it the fence cutting wars. In Texas, between $200,000 and $500,000 of barbed wire fence was destroyed in a single year. In Wyoming, armed conflict. In New Mexico, bodies. Men who had ignored the wire in 1875, who had cut it in the dark and walked their cattle through the gap, were now watching the open range close around them faster than they could cut wire. By 1883, the open range was already dying. The wire was just making it visible. The last major cattle drive on the Chisholm Trail occurred in 1884. Not because anyone passed a law, not because anyone held a vote, because by 1884, the trail was broken in so many places by so many fences that driving cattle through Kansas was no longer economically viable. The trail still existed, technically, but every fence turned distance into delay, delay into weight loss into loss. The men who had depended on the open range had not seen this coming in 1875 when they cut Jonas Holt's fence. They had seen a homesteader. They had not seen the 100,000 homesteaders behind him. And then came the winter. Not a hard winter, a killing winter. The kind of cold that arrives quietly on a Sunday and is still there 2 months later when you have stopped counting days and started counting losses. The winter of 1886 to 1887. The cattle did what 10,000 years of instinct had taught them. They turned their backs to the wind. They drifted south, looking for shelter. But the wire stopped them. They pushed against the drift fences in the darkness, and the cold and the wire held. Some froze standing up, against the fence. Their bodies found weeks later, solid against the wire they could not cross, in drift that covered the fence posts themselves. Between 100,000 and 250,000 cattle died that winter. The same wire, the wrong reason. The land does not forgive the difference. By 1885, Jonas Holt's 160-acre claim in Ellis County was fenced on all 4 sides. South boundary, the original line. Now 10 years old and still standing on its original posts. East, west, and north. Added in stages as the wire became cheaper and the law made clear which side of this argument was going to win. He had kept the 40-cent boundary filing from 1875. He had kept every receipt from every roll of wire. He had kept the records. When the Kansas Fence Law of 1884 passed, Jonas Holt was not waiting for the law. The law was catching up to him. Vic Hollander did not die. He did not go to prison. He did not become a villain in the history books. He was just a man who had been right about one thing, that the open range had worked well, and had fed a nation, and wrong about another, that the open range was going to last. By 1885, Vic Hollander was no longer driving cattle through Ellis County. There was no road left to drive them through. He had found other work. Ranching on a smaller, fenced piece of land he had claimed under the same Homestead Act that had given Jonas Holt his 160 acres. He had bought his own barbed wire at 12 cents a pound. By 1890, 200,000 tons of barbed wire were being manufactured every year. The prairie that had been open range since before any white man stood on it was fenced into ownership in less than 20 years. Not by any act of Congress, not by any court decision, not by any army, by wire. Cheap, simple, democratic wire that any man with $8 and 2 days of his own time could string between posts and call a boundary. The men who built America with it did not wait for permission. They waited for the wire to arrive. Then they strung it. Then they strung it again. Then a third time. The same wire. The same posts. The same 12 cents a pound. What changed was not the wire. What changed was the world's willingness to accept what the wire was saying. The wire had been saying it since 1875. It took the rest of Kansas a decade to hear it. They were not heroes. They were not visionaries. They were farmers who had looked at the production numbers, understood what they meant, filed their 40-cent land document, and refused to stop building the thing that needed to be built. This story draws from documented history. Joseph Glidden's 1874 patent is real. The production numbers are real. 5 tons in 1874, 300 in 1875, 40,000 by 1880, 200,000 by 1890. The fence-cutting wars of 1883 are documented. The last Chisholm Trail Drive in 1884 is documented. The winter die-up of 1886 to 1887 killed between 100,000 and 250,000 cattle. The Kansas Fence Law was enacted in 1884. Jonas Holt, Vic Hollander, and Heinrich Baumer are fictional characters inside this real history. The wire is real. The fence is real. The land is always real. History remembers the loud men. But America was often built by quieter ones. If you are the kind of person who builds things that get torn down and gets up the next morning and builds them again, you already know why you're here. Subscribe. New story every morning. Have you ever built something that others kept tearing down and kept building it anyway? Leave that in the comments. I read every one. The future rarely arrives all at once. Usually, it starts with one man rebuilding a fence before sunrise. This is American soil.